The FIA has just reviewed hidden engine data that could be worth up to 4/10 per lap. And Mercedes is at the center of it. We are talking about a potential 15 horsepower advantage. Not from a new turbo. Not from extra fuel flow. But from something almost invisible. Compression ratio. Cold, the engine reads perfectly legal. 16:1. Exactly within the regulation. But when it reaches full race temperature, rivals believe that number could climb. 17. Maybe even 18:1. More compression means more efficiency. More efficiency means more power. And more power means dominance on long straights. Pre-season testing is over. The data has been analyzed. A power unit failure triggered deeper FIA inspection. A formal dossier was submitted by rival teams. And now an imminent vote could force a mid-season engine redesign. If the FIA introduces a mandatory hot temperature test, Mercedes could be forced to lower compression, lose horsepower, recalibrate the entire combustion concept. Mid-championship. But if the vote fails, any structural advantage remains untouched. And that could shape the entire 2026 era before it even fully begins. This is not a rumor. This is regulatory escalation. And what happens next could decide who controls the future of Formula One. So let's break down exactly what happened after pre-season testing ended. Because the tension did not start with headlines. It started with data. In Bahrain, one of the Mercedes-affiliated power units suffered a serious failure during testing. At first glance, that looks like a reliability issue. Engines fail in testing all the time. But this one triggered something different. A deeper FIA inspection. Not just routine checks. A detailed look at internal architecture. At the same time, rival manufacturers submitted a formal technical dossier raising concerns about how Mercedes' combustion chamber behaves under temperature. That is when the compression debate exploded internally. Under the 2026 regulations, the maximum compression ratio is capped at 16:1. That is a clear number. But here is the critical detail. The current measurement process checks compression at ambient temperature. Cold, static. No real race conditions involved. And this is where suspicion begins. Several teams believe Mercedes may have designed its piston geometry and combustion chamber volumes in a way that appears legal when cold, but changes behavior when hot. According to technical theories circulating in the paddock, there could be microscopic cavities or channels inside the combustion architecture. When the engine is cold, those cavities count toward the total chamber volume. Compression reads 16:1. Perfectly legal. But when the engine reaches full race temperature, around 130 degrees Celsius, thermal expansion and pressure could effectively isolate that extra volume, reducing chamber size, increasing effective compression, possibly towards 17 or even 18:1. If that is true, the impact is not cosmetic. Higher compression means more efficient combustion. More efficient combustion means more power from the same fuel mass. Estimates in the paddock suggest gains of 10 to 15 horsepower. On high-speed circuits, that could translate into 3 or 4/10 per lap. And in modern Formula One, that is the difference between pole position and the second row. Now consider the timing. Testing has finished. Teams are finalizing their Australian Grand Prix specifications. And instead of calm preparation, Mercedes finds itself under regulatory scrutiny. The FIA has not accused them of illegality. In fact, under the current protocol, the engine passes the required cold test. It is legal as written. But the governing body is now proposing a second measurement method. A mandatory hot test at operating temperature, added alongside the cold check. This proposal will be voted on by the Power Unit Advisory Committee. And to pass, it requires a supermajority among engine manufacturers, plus approval from the FIA and Formula One management. That makes this more than technical. It becomes political. Because if the hot test is approved and introduced mid-season, Mercedes may be forced to redesign key engine components. Pistons. Combustion chamber geometry, internal volumes. And under the current development freeze, those changes are extremely restricted. This is not just about passing a test. It is about protecting a concept that may have taken years to perfect. And here is why tension inside Mercedes is reportedly high. They must now prepare for two possibilities. 1. The hot test passes. 2. It does not. If it passes, they need a compliant backup specification ready. If it does not, they must continue extracting maximum performance while political pressure builds. Either way, resources are divided. Focus shifts. Engineering time is consumed by contingency planning instead of pure performance gains. And that is how championships quietly shift. Not through penalties, but through distraction. The Australian Grand Prix now becomes more than the opening round. It becomes a spotlight. If Mercedes shows extraordinary straight-line performance in Melbourne, the compression debate intensifies. If they appear balanced, suspicion cools. But behind the scenes, the vote looms. And once that decision is made, there will be no gray zone left. Either the loophole closes, or it becomes the defining battleground of the 2026 engine era. Now we enter the most sensitive phase of this entire situation. Because once the FIA calls for a vote, the issue stops being technical and becomes strategic. Inside the Power Unit Advisory Committee, every manufacturer will calculate risk. Not just performance risk. Political risk. If the hot test at operating temperature is approved, it immediately changes the engine landscape. No more cold-only measurement. No more relying on ambient conditions. Real compression under real heat would be verified. And if Mercedes' effective ratio climbs above 16:1 in those conditions, that specification would no longer be homologable under the updated protocol. That does not mean instant championship bans. It means something equally disruptive. Forced redesign. And under the 2026 free structure, redesign space is extremely limited. Manufacturers can only introduce changes through tightly controlled development windows. If Mercedes is considered competitive, they do not easily qualify for extra upgrade opportunities. Which means any redesign costs valuable tokens and time. And time is everything in Formula One. Now imagine the pressure internally. Engineers reviewing thermal expansion coefficients. Lawyers analyzing regulatory wording. Performance departments calculating how much power is lost if compression drops by even a fraction. Because losing 10 horsepower is noticeable. Losing 15 changes qualifying battles. And the paddock already believes the Mercedes 2026 Power Unit is among the strongest, precisely because of this possible compression edge. If that edge disappears mid-season, it shifts the competitive order instantly. But there is an even more dramatic scenario. If the FIA clarifies in writing that the 16:1 limit must apply at all times while the car is running, not just during static measurement, and then proves that an engine exceeded that ratio in competition, it becomes a technical infringement. And technical infringements during an event lead to disqualification from that event. Points lost. Results erased. That is the hardline scenario. No one has reached that stage. But the fact that it is even being discussed shows how serious this is. Now let's look at the alternatives. There is talk of a political compromise. Allow the current interpretation for the 2026 season. Introduce the mandatory hot test fully in 2027. That would avoid mid-season chaos. But it would also allow any existing advantage to remain for an entire championship campaign, which rivals would not accept easily. Because 3 or 4 tenths per lap across a season is not marginal. It is structural. And that word matters. Structural advantages define eras. We have seen it before in Formula One. Double diffusers, oil burning controversies, flexible aero components. Once a gray area is exploited, the governing body must decide whether to defend literal wording or competitive balance. And that decision always leaves scars. So what does this mean for Australia? The Australian Grand Prix now becomes a stage under tension. Every straight-line speed trap will be analyzed. Every onboard audio clip will be dissected. Every telemetry comparison will fuel speculation. Because if Mercedes shows extraordinary top-end performance, pressure on the FIA intensifies immediately. If they appear conservative, it could suggest internal caution. Either way, the atmosphere is different. Pre-season testing is over. The freight has left Bahrain. And instead of calm anticipation for race 1, there is regulatory suspense. For Mercedes, this is about protecting years of engine development. For their rivals, it is about closing what they see as a potential loophole. And for the FIA, it is about credibility. Because once hidden technical evidence forces an imminent vote, neutrality must be visible. The decision cannot appear targeted. It must appear principled. So now the sport waits. Not for lap times. Not for qualifying simulations. But for a vote. A vote that could redefine how compression is measured. A vote that could force redesigns. A vote that could quietly determine whether the 2026 championship begins level or already tilted. And once that decision is announced, there will be no gray area left. Only consequences. And here is where the real fracture line appears. Because once the FIA opens the door to changing how compression is measured, trust between teams shifts permanently. Even if Mercedes is fully compliant today, the fact that hidden technical data triggered an imminent vote means one thing. The governing body believes the current measurement method may not reflect real operating conditions. That alone creates pressure. Now imagine the scenario inside Brackley this week. 2 parallel engine simulations running side by side. One optimized for maximum performance under the current cold test. Another engineered to survive a mandatory hot test at operating temperature. That is not a minor adjustment. That is redesign territory. If compression must remain strictly at 16:1 under full thermal load, combustion chamber geometry changes. Piston crown shape changes. Ignition timing windows shift. Turbo efficiency mapping adjusts. And every one of those changes affects drivability, fuel consumption, reliability margins. The Mercedes engine concept may have been built around pushing the interpretation of that 16:1 limit as far as physics allows under cold inspection. If the measurement philosophy changes, the entire architecture recalibrates. Now look at the ripple effect. Mercedes supplies multiple customer teams. Any forced redesign impacts not just one car. It impacts an entire group. McLaren, Williams, potentially Alpine if applicable. A mid-season compression adjustment would require recalibration across several chassis platforms. Cooling balance changes. Energy deployment strategies shift. Gearbox mapping may need refinement. This is not isolated. It is ecosystem-wide. And that is why the vote matters so much. Because if 4 of the 5 engine manufacturers approve the hot test introduction, it becomes official. And once it becomes official, there is no room for interpretation. If the engine exceeds 16:1 under the new hot protocol, that specification cannot be homologated under the updated rules. That is not a penalty in the traditional sense. It is eligibility. If it fails, it cannot run. Which forces Mercedes to either introduce a revised specification or continue using an older, less aggressive one. And that means performance compromise. But there is an even more volatile angle. If the FIA issues a clarification stating that 16:1 must apply at all times during competition, and later proves through inspection that an engine exceeded that value while racing, then the matter escalates into a technical infringement during an event. In that case, disqualification from that event becomes the logical outcome. No retroactive championship removal. But race results erased. Points lost. Momentum shattered. That is the scenario nobody wants. Not Mercedes. Not the FIA. Not the sport. Which is why political compromise is being discussed. There are whispers of a transitional solution. Allow 2026 to proceed under the current cold test. Mandate full hot compliance by 2027. That would stabilize the short term.